There are moments that history remembers. Then there are moments that history almost lost forever. This was the second kind. Long before anyone called it legendary, before music historians argued about it, before old television reels gathered dust inside forgotten vaults, there was only a room, 8,000 beating hearts, 2 men carrying invisible wounds, and one impossible dare that would change them both forever. The applause had barely faded when an eerie silence settled over the Nashville Municipal Auditorium. It was not the comfortable silence that follows a great performance. It was the uneasy silence that comes before something no one planned. Television cameras continued to glide across the audience. Producers behind the control booth exchanged confused glances. Nobody had changed the schedule. Nothing unusual was supposed to happen, yet every instinct in the room whispered that the evening had quietly drifted away from the script. In the third row sat Elvis Presley. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, polished shoes, and the famous sunglasses the world had come to recognize before it even recognized his face. To millions watching at home, he looked exactly as he always did. Confident, untouchable, the king. But appearances had become Elvis's greatest performance. Behind those dark lenses were eyes that had forgotten what peaceful sleep felt like. For months, every day had blended into the next. Las Vegas, private jets, hotels, interviews, bright lights, standing ovations, smiling photographs. Late-night rehearsals, another show, another encore, another exhausted morning. The crowds kept growing. The applause became louder every year. Yet the louder the world celebrated him, the quieter he became inside. Fame had given him everything people dream about: money, power, luxury, recognition, but it had quietly stolen something no headline ever mentioned. Silence. Real silence. The kind where a man could hear his own soul. Tonight he had come only to watch, nothing more. Colonel Tom Parker had repeated those instructions several times before Elvis left for Nashville. Smile for the cameras. Shake a few hands. Do not perform. Save your voice for Vegas. Simple, predictable, safe. Elvis had nodded without arguing, not because he agreed, because arguing had become exhausting. Still, the moment he stepped inside the municipal auditorium, something inside him shifted. This place didn't smell like expensive casinos. It didn't feel like Hollywood. There were no flashing slot machines, no glittering costumes, no screaming crowds demanding another hit record. Instead, there was the familiar scent of old wooden floors, fresh hymn books, church perfume, warm stage lights, and somewhere beneath all of it, memory. The first choir began singing. The sound drifted gently through the auditorium. Most people simply listened. Elvis closed his eyes. Suddenly he wasn't 36 years old anymore. He was 8. Barely tall enough to see over the wooden pew in a tiny church in Tupelo. His feet dangled above the floor. Beside him sat Gladys Presley. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wore a simple dress she had carefully ironed the night before. But when she sang, the entire church seemed brighter. She never sang to impress anyone. She sang because she believed every word. Little Elvis would always glance toward her whenever the congregation reached the chorus. Without fail, she smiled, placed one gentle hand against his chest, then whispered the same sentence every Sunday. "Sing from here first." Her hand rested over his heart. Only afterward would she touch his throat. Your voice follows your heart." Those words had never left him. Everything else had changed. His home, his life, his friends, his fame, even his own reflection. But those words, they still lived somewhere deep inside him. A burst of applause pulled Elvis back to the present. Johnny Cash had just finished his scheduled performance. Dressed in black from head to toe, he acknowledged the audience with a small nod. Everyone expected him to leave the stage. Instead, he remained standing. One hand rested lightly on the microphone, the other slipped into his pocket. He looked unusually thoughtful, almost troubled. The audience gradually became quiet. Television directors motioned for the cameras to stay on him. Something was happening. Even they didn't know what. Johnny slowly lifted his head. His eyes scanned the audience until they found one familiar face. Elvis. For a long moment, neither man moved. It felt less like two musicians looking at one another, and more like two old friends, recognizing the pain neither had ever spoken aloud. Johnny finally smiled. "You know," his deep southern voice rolled gently across the auditorium, "I've spent most of my life believing music tells the truth better than people do." A few quiet laughs drifted through the crowd. He continued, "Songs don't care how famous you are. They don't care how much money you've made. They don't care how many records you've sold. They only care whether your heart is telling the truth." The room grew still. Johnny took another slow breath. "We've got someone very special with us tonight." The audience immediately began applauding. Many already knew who he meant. Johnny nodded toward the third row. Before the movies, before the gold records, before the world called him the king, there was a young man who sang gospel with every piece of his soul. Every camera turned toward Elvis. He forced a polite smile, raised one hand, expected the applause to pass. It didn't. Johnny's smile slowly disappeared. His next words carried a weight that seemed to settle over every person in the building. "I miss that young man." The applause stopped almost instantly. So does America. Elvis lowered his eyes. His fingers tightened around the armrest. Johnny wasn't criticizing him. He was reaching for him, reaching beneath the fame, beneath the headlines, beneath the legend, straight toward the frightened little boy who still missed his mother every single day. Johnny leaned closer to the microphone. "Elvis." His voice softened. "I know you came here as a guest. I know nobody expects you to sing. I know this wasn't part of the program." A brief pause. Then came the sentence no one in that room would ever forget. "But tonight, I'm asking you to forget all of that." Another pause, long enough for every heartbeat inside the auditorium to become noticeable. "I'm daring you." A wave of whispers spread through the audience. Johnny never looked away from Elvis. "I dare you to leave the king in that chair. I dare you to walk onto this stage. I dare you to sing the way you did before anyone knew your name." His voice almost broke. "And if you can, sing for the woman who first taught you how." Silence. Absolute silence. Gladys Presley. Johnny never spoke her name. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. Elvis felt as though the air had vanished from the room. The noise, the lights, the cameras, everything disappeared. All he could hear was one gentle voice from years ago. "Sing from here first." His mother's hand pressed against his small chest. her smile, her faith, her love. For 13 years he had buried those memories beneath applause. Tonight, one sentence had unearthed them all. Very slowly, Elvis reached for his sunglasses. The entire auditorium watched without breathing. He removed them. For the first time that evening, the world saw tears already gathering in his eyes. He placed the glasses carefully on the empty seat beside him, drew one long, trembling breath. Then, he rose to his feet. The moment Elvis Presley rose from his seat, the atmosphere inside the Nashville Municipal Auditorium changed forever. No one applauded, no one cheered. No one dared to break the silence. It was as though every soul inside the building instinctively understood that applause no longer belonged in this moment. 8,000 people watched as Elvis took his first step toward the stage. Then another. His polished shoes echoed softly against the wooden floor. Each footstep sounded impossibly loud. Television cameramen instinctively abandoned their planned shots. Every lens turned toward him. Millions watching from home leaned closer to their television screens. Some whispered his name. Others simply stared. This wasn't the confident swagger the world knew. There was no smile, no playful wave, no performer greeting his audience. This was something far more vulnerable. Elvis walked like a man returning to a place he had spent years trying to escape. Johnny Cash never moved. He remained standing beside the microphone, watching Elvis approach with quiet respect. As Elvis reached the front of the stage, Johnny stepped forward and offered his hand. For a brief second, neither man spoke. They simply looked at one another. In Johnny's eyes, Elvis didn't see another superstar. He saw understanding. The kind that can exist only between two men who have fought battles no audience ever witnessed. Johnny leaned closer. His voice was barely audible. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you." Elvis swallowed. "I know. I was trying to remind you." A faint smile appeared on Elvis's face. "I know that too." Johnny gently squeezed his hand. "You don't have to sing perfectly." Elvis looked toward the audience. Thousands of faces, thousands of strangers, yet somehow they didn't feel like strangers anymore. "When don't waiting for perfection," Johnny whispered. "They're waiting for honesty." Those words settled deep inside Elvis. For years he had believed every performance had to be flawless, every movement rehearsed, every note controlled. Tonight, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he could control anything. And perhaps that was exactly what made this different. Johnny slowly stepped away from the microphone. The stage belonged to Elvis now. The house band looked toward him, waiting for instructions. The pianist quietly rested his fingers above the keys. The guitarist adjusted his strap. The drummer lifted his sticks. Elvis slowly raised one hand. No band. The musicians froze. "I need to hear my own heart first." The conductor nodded respectfully. Every instrument fell silent. The auditorium became almost unnaturally still. Elvis closed his eyes. The silence was frightening. It forced him to hear memories he had spent years trying to drown beneath applause. He remembered sitting beside his mother after church. He remembered the old family radio. He remembered evenings when the lights inside their tiny house barely worked. Gladys would hum hymns while preparing supper. Sometimes she stopped singing halfway through a verse. Little Elvis would continue the melody. She would laugh, then pull him into a hug. "One day," she would whisper, "God is going to use that voice." Back then, neither of them imagined the world. Neither imagined stadiums. Neither imagined fame. She simply believed. That memory hit Elvis with unexpected force. His breathing grew uneven. Across the stage, Johnny watched quietly. He recognized the look. He had seen it in mirrors. A man wrestling with ghosts. The audience remained completely silent. Even the television crew had forgotten they were broadcasting live. Nobody spoke through their headsets. Nobody adjusted cables. Nobody looked away. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Elvis slowly stepped closer to the microphone. His hands trembled, not from fear of singing, from fear of remembering. He opened his eyes. They were wet. He looked toward the ceiling lights. For one fleeting moment, he imagined his mother sitting somewhere beyond them, smiling exactly the way she had smiled in that little church so many years before. A quiet breath escaped his lips. "So much of my life," he began softly, "has been spent trying to become someone the world expected." He paused. "And somewhere along the way, I forgot the little boy who only wanted to sing because it made his mama smile." Several people in the front rows lowered their heads. Others quietly wiped away tears. Johnny looked down at the stage floor. His own eyes had begun to fill. Elvis smiled faintly. "I don't know if my voice is the same anymore." A gentle laugh moved through the audience. "But maybe faith remembers melodies that people forget." The room answered with complete silence. Not because no one cared, because everyone did, more than they could express. Elvis inhaled slowly. His fingers tightened around the microphone. His shoulders rose. His eyes closed once more. The first note had not yet been sung, yet somehow, the entire auditorium already felt transformed. Johnny folded his hands together, not like an entertainer waiting for another performance, like a believer waiting for a prayer. And in that sacred silence, as 8,000 hearts waited together, Elvis finally parted his lips. For one endless heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, Elvis sang. The first note left his lips almost like a whisper. It wasn't loud, it wasn't polished. It wasn't the powerful voice that had filled arenas across the world. It was fragile, almost trembling. Yet somehow, that single note carried more truth than every standing ovation he had received in the previous decade. The silence inside the Nashville Municipal Auditorium became sacred. No one shifted in their seat. No one cleared their throat. Even the television cameras seemed to move more slowly, afraid that the smallest sound might disturb the moment unfolding before them. Elvis continued. Each line seemed less like a performance and more like a confession. Every word stripped away another layer of the legend. The king disappeared. The little boy from Tupelo remained. His eyes stayed closed. He wasn't singing to the audience anymore. He wasn't singing for television. He wasn't singing for history. He was singing to the one person he had wished could hear him one more time. His mother. Across the stage, Johnny Cash lowered his head. His hands, rough from years of guitar strings and hard roads, trembled slightly. He knew that feeling. He knew what it meant to carry grief for so many years that it quietly became part of who you were. He also knew that healing rarely arrived with noise. Sometimes, it arrived on the back of a single, honest song. As Elvis reached the final verse, his voice grew stronger. Not because he forced it, because he had finally stopped fighting it. The fear disappeared, the shame disappeared, the pressure to be perfect disappeared. Only faith remained. Johnny slowly stepped beside him. He never asked permission. He simply stood shoulder to shoulder with his friend. For a brief moment he listened. Then, almost instinctively, he joined the harmony. His deep voice rapped gently beneath Elvis's melody. Neither man tried to overpower the other. Neither tried to become the center of attention. They sang as two broken souls holding one another upright. The harmony filled every corner of the auditorium. People in the front rows began quietly wiping tears from their faces. A woman reached for her husband's hand. An elderly pastor removed his glasses and bowed his head. One of the camera operators blinked repeatedly, trying to clear his eyes before the director switched to his shot. Backstage, musicians who had spent decades entertaining audiences stood completely motionless. Some had witnessed hundreds of concerts. None had witnessed anything like this. The final note lingered in the air. Then, silence. No applause. Not immediately. It was as though no one wanted to be the first person to interrupt what they had just experienced. Elvis slowly opened his eyes. For a second he looked almost surprised, as if he had forgotten where he was. Johnny turned toward him. Neither man spoke. Words suddenly felt too small. Elvis smiled through tears. "So," he whispered with a quiet laugh, "I guess you won that day." Johnny laughed softly. "No." He gently shook his head. "We both did." Elvis looked across the audience. "I spent years believing people expected me to be larger than life." He paused. "But tonight, you reminded me that sometimes people only need us to be human." Johnny nodded. "And being human takes more courage than being famous." Those words settled over the room like a final prayer. At last. Someone in the back of the auditorium slowly rose to their feet. Then another. Then another. Within moments, every person in the building was standing. Not with wild celebration, not with shouting, but with quiet respect. The applause that followed was unlike anything either man had ever heard. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't frantic. It was steady, gentle, almost grateful. Elvis looked around the auditorium. His smile grew warmer. For the first time in a very long while, he didn't feel trapped by the expectations that came with being Elvis Presley. He simply felt free. Johnny placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember this night." "I will. When things get loud again," Johnny continued. "Remember this silence." Elvis nodded slowly. "I think," he said, "I've been searching for this feeling for years." Backstage, after the audience had finally left, the two friends sat alone in the quiet dressing room. No reporters, no photographers, no managers. Only 2 cups of coffee resting on a small wooden table. For several minutes they said nothing. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Finally, Johnny smiled. "You know, I almost didn't call you up there." Elvis looked at him. "What changed your mind?" Johnny stared into his coffee. I realized that sometimes the greatest act of friendship isn't protecting someone from pain. He looked back at Elvis. It's reminding them they are strong enough to face it. Elvis sat quietly. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. Inside was a small, worn handkerchief, one his mother had given him years before. The fabric had faded. The edges were frayed. He unfolded it carefully. I've carried this almost everywhere. Johnny looked at it. You never told anyone? I didn't have to, Elvis smiled. It reminded me where I came from. Johnny nodded. And tonight, you finally let everyone else see it. Outside, the lights of Nashville shimmered against the spring night. Cars slowly pulled away from the auditorium. Families walked together, speaking softly about what they had witnessed. Some talked about the music. Others talked about faith. Many talked about forgiveness. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. They had arrived expecting a concert. They left having witnessed something far more important. Not perfection, not spectacle, but honesty. Years later, countless people would remember the songs Elvis recorded. They would remember the sold-out shows, the records, the movies, the headlines, and the fame. Yet for those who had been inside that auditorium, another memory would always shine brighter. The memory of two friends standing beneath warm stage lights, one daring the other to remember who he truly was, the other finding the courage to answer. Because legends are remembered for their achievements, but they are loved for the moments they remind us that even the brightest stars carry scars. And sometimes, the most unforgettable performance is not the one with the loudest applause. It is the one that gives people permission to heal. As the stage lights dimmed for the final time that night, Elvis looked once more toward the empty auditorium. He smiled gently, almost as if somewhere beyond the darkness, his mother was smiling back. And for the first time in many years, that was enough.